You may not know the name Crispin Cioe, but you know his music. Love Shack, Hot, 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 Living in America, among many others. Crispin's a saxophonist, songwriter, producer, arranger, co-founder of the Uptown Horns. He grew up in Detroit, where he was influenced by Motown, rock and roll, and jazz, studied film and writing at University of Michigan, Wayne State, and Berklee School of Music. Crispin has toured and recorded with the Stones, James Brown, Ray Charles, B-52s, Robert Plant, Solomon Burke, Joe Cocker, Debbie Harry, Aretha Franklin. The list goes on and on. And Crispin has music-directed TV shows like the Kennedy Center Mark Twain Prize for Humor and in performance live from the White House. Crispin continues to perform live. We were just talking about that before the cameras started rolling. Been on TV with friends like Darlene Love, Stephen Van Zandt. So Crispin, enough of the intro. Welcome to 06880, the podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here.
Amazing story. So let me start with Detroit. If you had not grown up in Detroit, would you be where you are now?
Probably not. But I was born in Detroit, and then my family lived in Chicago early years, and I lived pretty near Maxwell Street, which is where, the blues really, like Muddy Waters, people like that came out. And I had a babysitter when I was a little kid that I dimly remember, and she had a little shop on Maxwell Street where she sold, used clothes and furniture. My mother told me that she would put me in a old armchair out on the street, and I did hear probably some of those blues people.
Wow.
As a little 2 or 3 year old. But we moved briefly to New York, and then when I was 12, we moved to Detroit, where I was born. And yeah, it was in 1960. So that was the beginning of Motown. And I didn't think, I took music for granted, like something I always did. But all through that period, I wanted to, I think, be a writer and do film. And that's why that's what I studied at University of Michigan. But somewhere in there in the late 60s, my best friend growing up was James Montgomery, who people know around here from the James Montgomery Blues. And we had a jug band in high school, which again, I didn't take that seriously, just was having fun. But after about 3.5 years of college in Ann Arbor, I thought, deep in my heart, I am a musician. And then I just converted, ever since then, that's what I do. I did go back to writing when I first moved to New York City. Because I could write, I did freelance writing about music for different magazines and for the Soho Weekly News and the Village Voice. But that was to make the rent. I moved to New York ultimately to be, where I wanted to be with music.
And why the sax?
Well, I played clarinet growing up, in grade school and junior high school. And I guess I did play a little bit of sax in a band that would play things like, Peter Gunn, in seventh grade. But I didn't take it seriously. And then as I got older and I was in college, I realized that, there's something about the sound that really grabs me this way. And I had friends, most of my friends were musicians. So when I got serious about it, I played a lot, took lessons, and then ultimately went to music school for a couple of years at Wayne State in Detroit, and then at Berklee School of Music in Boston. Then I ran out of money, and I've been playing in bars and concert stages and studios ever since,
But that list of people that you've played with, how do you get to play with people like that?
Well, the last place I moved to New York in 1976, that year, like of anniversary in the summer. But I had been in Ann Arbor and Detroit with a band. After I was at Berklee, I moved back and joined a band called Radio King and his Court of Rhythm. And these were friends I'd gone to college with. And we ended up moving to Boston for greener pastures. And I was back there 2 or 3 years. And when I decided to leave that band, what I wanted to do, my dream was to live in New York. So I just moved into the city. And I think I wanted to study with a couple of great woodwind teachers who were still doing it then. And I hit the pavement running, And I played in bars and stuff like that. As I said, I wrote about music, so I made a lot of connections, new people. And after about 4 years of doing that, I was starting to get work. I played with a singer named Carolyn Moss, who got signed to a record deal. I lived in the Village near Bleecker, on Thompson Street near Bleecker for like 9 years. And I played with her. She got a record deal. We made some records. We toured. That led to other things. And then in 1980, I had met a couple other guys who were horn players, Arno Hecht and a trumpet player we were playing with then. And they were friends, and we would, jam and play different places. And they thought, that Arno had already come up with the name, the Uptown Horns. And I just thought, this is a perfect time to start a new horn section in that atmosphere then in the music business. And we took a fourth member on trombone, Bob Funk. And there used to be a club in New York called Tramps. This is kind of how I came up. And I knew the owner. It was on East 15th Street. And he asked me if I would host a jam or a party one night a week, Tuesday night. And this was when we were starting to coalesce as a horn section. And I thought, well, yeah, I don't want to really do that, just as a jam. I said, I'll do it if you can take out a separate ad on the Village Voice that says the Uptown Horns Party, because we were starting to, figure it out. And we did that, and we sort of made it look like it was a jam, but in the afternoon, people would come down and we'd rehearse with them and do little arrangements. So when the audience came, it was like they thought they were seeing it, this thrown together thing, but great people would get up. And it caught on at the moment. It was just the right moment for that kind of thing. And there were lines around the block. And then people started coming down, people I knew, people we made friends with, like Doc Pomus used to come down, wow. The amazing Doc Pomus, the songwriter. And I was friends with him. And years later, my sister married his son, but that's just, happenstance. And Doc would bring tunes down, new tunes he'd written, and a singer, and then he'd have the charts, and we'd play them. And, he wanted to hear his new tunes, and things like that happened a lot for 2 years, and then we started getting, Dr. John used to come down all the time, people like that. Elvis Costello came down, Southside Johnny, Mitch Ryder, many, many people. And musicians, some jazz musicians who wanted to hear they'd write a piece, and we were a ready-made horn section, Yeah. And after 2 years of that, we had a name out there, we were playing on records by that time. And then I knew the new manager at the time of the Jay Giles Band, who I had known previously, and he called me up and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "We started a horn section." He said, "I managed the Jay Giles Band. They're looking for a horn section." This was like 1982 or 3. And Seth Justman, who was a keyboard player, producer at that time of that band, came down to New York and heard us. And we talked all night, and he said, "Well, you want to come up to Boston and go on a tour?" Which we did, and they had the number one record, Freeze Frame and Centerfold. Sure. And by that time, we were rolling. So we spent 10 years doing that, based out of New York, touring and trying to play on records and stuff like that.
And the Steel Wheels tour was part of that?
The culmination of that really was 10 years later. We had a name. And we sounded good. And, I think what happened was Mick Jagger asked three of his friends if they were going to take on a horn section, who would they recommend? And all three of them turned out to have been people we knew, friends, and they all said us. So he called us, and he said, "We're rehearsing at Nassau Coliseum. I'm going to send you a cassette tape with 12 songs. Be there tomorrow, and I want to hear them with the band." And then, so we did it. We stayed up all night and arranged the tunes. Most of them didn't have horns, and we went to Nassau, and we went into a little room with Mick and Chuck Lavelle, the keyboard player, whom we had played with on various things, and just played these 12 arrangements for Mick. And he said, "Oh, that's great, He says, what about Satisfaction, And I think I said, "You want to hear the Otis Redding horn parts?" And he went, "Yeah, we did that." And he said, "All right, let's go out and play with the band."
Yeah.
And he hadn't told them we were coming. They were like, but we got up and we played 12 songs, shook hands with them, and 2 days later we were on the road, and did the Steel Wheels tour, and then it turned into called the Urban Jungle Tour around the world, But we had already toured.
Yeah.
We toured in the mid-'80s with the Robert Plant and the Honeydrippers. He did a record called The Honeydrippers.
Sure.
Had a big hit with Sea of Love. And so Ahmet Ertegun told him, if we're going to back your regular rock and roll album, you got to take out a horn section and do, the Honeydripper stuff, because it was a big record. And we spent about a year with him doing that. And that was in the mid-'80s. He was fantastic, just a musical nerd,
Wow. What do horns add? Well, why do the Stones want horns? Why did
I think it's different with different people. The Stones are, behind their image and everything are all of them serious music nerds. Like the first time we met Mick, a producer had called us a couple of years earlier, and he was mixing the cover they did of cover song of Harlem Shuffle, which was an old R&B tune, pretty obscure. And we worked in the studio with Mick for this mix, and he said, "I don't think we're going to use horns, but it sounds good, And I said, "What? This is pretty obscure. I kind of remember it, but who was it? Bob and Earl? Was that?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, Bob and Earl." Fury Records, 32002, like B-side, that's the way they are behind. And, Keith Richards, they're all fanatics about the history of music. Charlie Watts was, alive, and we toured with him, and he was, we long plane rides, hang out a lot. I said to him once on a plane ride, because I know he was a jazz player, I said, what happened when you joined the band? Because you hadn't played this music. And he goes, "Yeah, I really had to figure out what the source was." And he said, I listened to records, I thought about it. They told me to listen to these guys who played on the Chicago blues, like Freddie Ballou, people like that. And he said, I knew it went back further, so I finally figured it out. He said, it was Baby Dodds, who was a drummer in New Orleans before 1920, and played on the riverboats.
Yeah.
And he figured out, in his estimation, that's where the backbeat started, the precursor to rock and roll. And because they'd go up and down, it was a party boat, from New Orleans up and down. And he was, Baby Dodds was, in the first recorded. So that's the level of commitment these guys have. And I found that with many of the great people I've worked with. They see horns differently. The Stones are so steeped in blues and R&B that to them, like I think Keith Richards has said that when he wrote Satisfaction, the big line he thought would be a horn line, but he was going to do it on guitar. So that's So when they decided to add horns, I mean, they did have horns earlier. They had Bobby Keys, who was with us for that whole tour at the time. So it's natural for them. Other people, you know, different. We played with Joe Cocker, and he definitely was pro horns, you know, from the records that he loved.
Now, with all these different artists, do you change to adapt to them,
Yes.
or do they change to adapt to you?
Well, with people that big, it's their, you know, it's their trolley ride, you know. So
You figure out what they need.
well, our thing is to, yeah, because we're serving them, you know. But usually they're the same thing. Although, well, I mentioned this group I just played with last night and
Yeah,
last
talk
week.
about what you
This
did
group
last
I've
night.
been playing with lately a little bit here and there is called the Smith Watt Steakhouse. And it's Chad Smith, who's the drummer from Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Andrew Watt, who is on the younger side compared to me, but he's like early 30s. He produced the Rolling Stones' new album and the one before that, and Paul McCartney's newest album, and Elton John and Brandi Carlile earlier this year. And he's a young guy, but he's an amazing musician and guitar player. And they have this band they do for when they're not doing other things called Smith Watt Steakhouse. And we do, Andrew sings, and then we bring up guests. So last week we had a concert where we had Brandi Carlile, Michael Stipe, David Lee Roth, Robert Randolph, Warren Haynes from Government Mule. And Andrew, who's a producer and arranger, was very specific about where he wanted horns. And since the music was some of it was pretty heavy, hard rock, you know, we were very attentive to how he wants to hear horns. So last night we played in Amagansett at the Stephen Talkhouse, and it worked. I mean, he knows what he wants, and I think that's true on that level. You know, those kind of people know
Yeah.
how they want to design their music, and if they like horns, you know, I support them 100%.
And who's the audience
For
what you're doing now?
for Smith Watt
Yeah.
Steakhouse, well, we've played at the Capitol Theater. Andrew's gotten really well known, and Chad is one of the best rock and roll drummers that I've ever heard and played with. So they're well known, and then they get these superstars. We did one at 2 Christmases ago at the Capitol Theater. There was a corporate event. It was a private event, but it was big, and they had Roger Daltrey, Elvis Costello, Billy Idol, all these people coming out and doing a few tunes. And, you know, the crowd went, you know, gaga, you know. So I think, I forget the question, but...
Well, we were talking before about younger audiences still being...
Yeah, I think someone
into
like Andrew
this.
Watt is bringing, because he's younger, and he also produces, by the way, Lady Gaga, and, you know, he just produced half of Madonna's new album. So he doesn't have categories about styles, you know, he's got something to offer as a producer and arranger. And I think it's infectious. When you listen to that kind of music that we're playing in that band, the audience these days is there. I mean, I also, with the Uptown Horns, we do a thing called the Best of the 70s with a band called Dizzy Fish, and we play theaters around here like Ridgefield Playhouse. And there's packed audiences. I mean, it is older people, but it's mixed, and it's that you can't do better than that music for, you know, in a lot of ways. It was just such a great combination of great music, influences, and technology at the time in the 70s. So there's an audience.
And when you look at the music industry today, you know, you've been through so many changes. And
Yeah.
What's your take on music today?
I think it's up for grabs. I mean, I'm still active, obviously, even at my, you know, age. You know, I play with people, all these different people all the time, and I record with a lot of people. I'm playing with a band around here called the Name Droppers, which was Charlie Karp started.
Charlie's old band, yeah.
But, you know, the bass player is Scott Spray and the drummer is Bobby Torello, and they both played with Johnny Winter for years, and I've known them. Great band, and they're doing original stuff, and they're building a local audience, and they're getting a national forum for their recordings. I think it's up for grabs. I think you can never predict. In my view, you can't predict what people are going to like. There'll be some fad like the disco era. And I remember when that was happening, I lived in New York, it seemed like that was going to be there forever. Yeah. But then it changed completely, And right now, I think young people who are, it always ends up being young people who influence, I think, where popular music goes. I think the rock and roll is sort of coming back, bizarrely enough, And things go in waves. I mean, blues, traditional blues and Chicago blues goes up and down. Yeah. It was really in a trough, I remember. And then the Blues Brothers came along on SNL, and say what people will, that anybody in the blues business who has labels and stuff will tell you that when they happened, they just completely uplifted the market for people like, everybody out there, who was playing the blues. And that happens. Right now, I'm flabbergasted by these things I play with when there's big audiences, for this music. Some of it played very authentically. Some of it played for younger people who may not know it, but they, the visceral thing of it really is something people crave.
Sure. Visceral is a great term. Great word. This is the 06880 podcast. So how does Crispin Cioe get to Westport?
Oh, well, I lived in New York for 25 years. And, as I laid out, how that progressed, and I got remarried in the early 90s. My wife's name is Krista Bradford. And at that time, we had a daughter, Catherine, who after we moved here, went to Staples, and now is a doctor. I was coming out here to do recording sessions with a guy named Dan Hartman,
sure,
who lived in Westport, had a studio in his home, and he's the guy who wrote, he wrote songs like Free Ride, for Edgar Winter, but he wrote Living in America and that whole period of James Brown's work. And by that time, we had been playing with him on his things he produced. And it's a bit of a story, but it's interesting. We were touring, I think, in 1985 with Robert Plant and the Honeydrippers all over the place. And we were way out. I think we were in Canada. And Dan called us and said, I've got a session. Where are you? And we said, well, we're in Vancouver. And he said, well, I'm in Los Angeles. Are you coming down? And he said, yeah, we're going to be there like next week. And he said, all right, it's James Brown. And we said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, Sylvester Stallone called me. This is how Dan Hartman, how great he was. He said, and told me, I want you to write a big hit for James Brown. He doesn't have a record deal, but I want him to get a record deal, and it'll be the big hit in Rocky IV, right? And Dan said on the phone, I wrote it. So when you're here next week, we'll record it. And we got there, and we went in the studio, and he put up the track, and it was amazing. It was the record. Those tracks became the record. And I said, because I'm a huge James Brown fan, I said, wow, I haven't heard James Brown sing that high since those old records from the 50s. He goes, oh, no. Dan said, that's me. It's a guide vocal to show him how to, what the melody is, So we cut it. James was not there. And by the end of the tour we were doing with Robert Plant, it was number one, and he got a record deal. So we came back. When we got back to New York, Dan said, okay, we're going to do a whole album in New York, and James Brown was there. And we did all the horn arrangements, and I played the sax solo on Living in America. So that's kind of, once we were out there really busy, especially in the 80s into the early 90s, we had a name and things just sort of, we were pretty quick on our feet, I'd say in the 80s in New York, we disciplined ourselves, if that's the right word, to go out every night we weren't working and hang out in clubs and VIP lounges, and because, like it or not, that's part of the, if you're doing, trying to happen in that kind of area of music, you got to be out there. So we did that. We had a band of our own at Tramps, and then we had a band later. We did our own album, and, we tried to be as active musically as we could.
And now you're in suburbia.
Yeah. Well, we moved out here because after 9/11, actually, we were living in Riverdale, and our daughter was going to Fieldston Ethical Culture, and we ran out of money for that because it kept going up, private school. And we thought, well, 9/11 happened, and Krista has her own business at that point. She used to be a TV investigative reporter. Her last job was on WNBC in New York. But when she left that, after we got married, she started her own executive recruiting thing, research and executive recruiting. And she was using had a lot of clients and things in the World Trade Center. And when 9/11 happened, we wanted to move, And we looked all over the place. And then I just thought, well, I go out to Dan Hartman's house, and he kept saying, you should move out here, So we looked and, saw Staples, and it was for our daughters, and her education. And that's what led to it, We sold our apartment in Riverdale and moved out here.
All right. So, you're surrounded by Nile Rodgers and
yes,
Keith Richards.
I have worked
and Jose
with Nile.
Feliciano.
I've worked with Nile, and I'm friends with him. I had a friend who was his regular sax player, Bill Holloman, at that point, and he couldn't do some things, so I did some tour. I went to Japan with Chic and Nile, and I love him. I love him. And oddly enough, or not oddly, he recently I realized he knows Andrew Watt, and they both revere each other.
Wow.
So Nile's really, because we had recorded with Nile and Bernard, his partner, when they were alive, Bernard Edwards of Chic, and that they are just, off the charts talented.
So Westport's worked out for you?
Yes, I love Connecticut, and I was kind of glad to have left New York at that point. And what I didn't realize would happen out here is there's all these great musicians and people involved in music out here who lived here, maybe like Charlie Karp I met when I first moved out, and just...
Charlie was a classmate of mine.
Yes. Was that what?
Classmate of mine.
Wow.
Yeah, at Staples.
At Staples. Well, meeting him, and David Hall, whom you know, has been the bass player with my old friend James Montgomery for like 20 years. And I just got out here and I saw this scene out here that didn't have the traffic and the hustle and bustle, and was actually more relaxed after all my years in New York. So I just gravitated, love playing in bands here, love recording here,
Wow. Have you ever done the Levitt?
Many times. Yeah, I did it with Charlie Karp.
Oh, that's right.
I did it with my own band, Cracked Ice. I did it with Darlene Love a couple of years ago.
That was a great...
Yeah.
She was 80 years old.
She's 85 now, and I'm still working with her. Not quite as much, but every Christmas we do like a serious month all over the country, because she's got those great songs.
Yeah.
And Stephen Van Zandt and Bruce Springsteen have been friends of hers for a long time, and Stephen produced her last album, and I worked on that with him. I've known him since the early 80s. Really, he has his own band called the Disciples of Soul, and at that point, I think it was 83, his horn players had moved to California, so we did some touring with him. So I've known him a long time. He's great.
So who have you not played with that you would love to
Well,
with?
some people who are gone, unfortunately, from the past that I would have loved, I did work with Ray Charles a couple of times, just once was a TV show, but I always dreamed about, if I'd have been around in the 50s, to play with him, in theaters and joints, and that would have been for me,
Yeah.
I never toured with James Brown, but we recorded. And again, just the way that music was, and certainly jazz, groups of my favorites, and there's plenty. I think one thing the Uptown Horns did, whether it was to our credit or not, was we got at the time, we were able to put horns more into heavy rock music and things where it hadn't been, and punk too.
Yeah.
We played on, one of our first sessions was an Iggy Pop album.
Oh, wow.
And, at the time, a lot of punk was going on. We used to play at CBGB's.
Uh-huh.
And that was an accomplishment, to this day, like this Smith Watt Band, to make horns accessible to people like that musically was a kind of something we always shot for, and I like that. Incidentally, Iggy is from Ann Arbor.
Oh, wow.
So I first met him there.
Okay.
And one of the huge influences early in my life of music, after I decided to do it, was a friend of mine who's passed away named Steve McKay, who was a great sax player in Ann Arbor. We went to college there. And he played with the Stooges and Iggy when they got together, and used to invite me to sit in. I was just starting out, and so I saw Iggy from he was a drummer, by the way. Iggy was a blues drummer, and had gone to Chicago when he was 17 or 18, and actually played with Muddy and people like that, and then came back and had his own band in Ann Arbor. And at some point, when I think it was the Summer of Love. MC5, that band, moved to Ann Arbor.
That's right, yeah.
And I think Iggy said, I don't want to play drums anymore. I want to sing, and that was it. MC5, and I knew them, the leader of that band, Wayne Kramer, the late, great Wayne Kramer, guitar player. I met him in that period, and he was really encouraging. And I was just starting out, but he said, you come over and play, let's jam, let's play. And he, along with some other people, encouraged me to go for it, which I needed at the time. You know what I mean? And I remained friends with him all, as long as he was alive. So that was, because it was pretty daunting. I was 21 or 22 starting, and a lot of my friends said, that's insane, you can't do this. And I just felt like, well, this is what I'm going to do, and I don't care how long it takes.
Yeah.
So.
And you've done it. Last question. This is great. I've learned a lot, and a musical journey that I've loved.
Yeah.
As you look back on all your years performing, touring,
Right.
recording, is there one singular moment, song, session, concert that says to you, this is
there are a
why
couple
I do this?
that I couldn't. It would have to be maybe a couple. One of them involves someone named Willy DeVille, and he had a band called Mink DeVille, and I actually co-produced a film called Heaven Stood Still, The Incarnations of Willy DeVille, and we screened it here, right on this stage, a couple of years ago, and it's a documentary. And the director used to live here, Larry Locke. I don't know if you know him. He's a documentary director, and he got my name and approached me and see if I'd like to do it. And I said, Willie had just died, and we did a memorial thing to him. And I said, yeah, I think I would. And that took 10 years to do. Wow. But the reason I'm mentioning him is because I played with him. Again, a friend of mine was playing sax with him in the early 80s and wanted to do other things and asked me if I would do some touring with Willie, with Mink DeVille. And I didn't know much about him. And I said, I checked it out. I said, yeah, And the first show we played was in New York at a place called the Ritz. First show I played. And he hadn't even come to the rehearsals, so I hadn't really experienced. And this guy, he was from, by the way, Stamford originally. This guy came out on stage, and he had a song called Mixed Up, Shook Up Girl that was one of his, huge hit in Europe, but, one of the great songs, of all time, and in kind of a Van Morrison influence, but very original. He came out, he was very striking looking with a pin spot on him, had a cigarette, and blew it up. And he started singing that tune, and I got the shivers.
Wow.
And that's why I did the documentaries, because I thought he was one of the most amazing singers. And I came off that stage, and at the side of the stage at the end of the show was Benny King, who I had played with. And I said, what are you doing here, Ben? And he said, Willy's one of my favorite singers.
Wow.
This is the guy,
Yeah.
Stand by me,
Sure.
And it was true. They had, he heard Willy sing, and he said, So that was one thing. I played with Aretha a couple of times, just not touring, and that gave me shivers. So that's how I measure it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I love playing with singers.
Well, you have played with many. You have brought joy to countless millions.
Last week, I had met Michael Stipe because 30 years ago, the Uptown Horns played on one of their tracks, Finest Work song, one of their songs from REM. But I didn't really know him, And last week, I was in this band, Smith Watt, and he was one of the singers. We backed up at this concert. And I was completely blown away. I'd never been on stage with him. Mm-hmm. And I always loved their music and knew he was great, but he was stunningly original. His voice, just in front of 1,000 people, just projected amazingly, and he was great on stage. We did Suspicious Minds. It was one of the ones he wanted to do by Elvis, and he just killed it. And, again, to me, that's inspiring,
Sure.
Getting to know singers.
We could talk for hours,
yeah,
but we can't. Time is up. But Crispin Cioe, thank you for sharing your story, your music. And
I'd come back anytime and tell you stories about, because I have done music directing for TV stuff, and I've got some great
that's the next
great
one.
stories there. Yeah.
That's the next one. Crispin, thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure.